Good day. Of course, I'm John Corstein, the Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center here at the Mariners Museum at Park. And today I'm going to tell the story of the first time that Confederate ironclads actually go out to sea for combat. It's a really big deal. And of course, when the Civil War broke out, as we all know, the Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Russell Mallory, recognizes that we have to have new types of ships in the South because we can never build as many wooden ships as the North can. Consequently, he advocates the purchase of ironclads overseas, as well as building ironclads within various ports in the South. The South realizes very quickly that it's got to have ironclads because when the Federals actually capture Port Royal Sound, there's not an ironclad there to disrupt the Union operations as DuPont, Rear Admiral Samuel Francis DuPont, puts his ships in an elliptical move so that they can bombard these two Confederate forts. You can go to YouTube and see a lecture I gave on the capture of Port Royal Sound. No ironclad meant the Federals could do what they want. Consequently, we see that the Confederates start to really build ironclads in every one of its major ports. Now, Charleston is no different than anywhere else, but the ironclad program is a little slower to get underway, and it's not until January 1862 that they begin to build the first ironclad. And it's under construction at Cameron and Company at Charleston, and that is known as the CSS Palmetto State. And, you know, the great thing is, as it's under construction, a very important officer will take over command of the Department of South Carolina and Georgia, and his name happens to be Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, or P.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter, the hero of Bull Run, First Manassas. Nevertheless, you know, he's a West Pointer, he's an engineer, he temporarily was in command of the Army, which will eventually become the Army of Tennessee. He went on sick leave, unauthorized, and so Jefferson Davis takes that command away from him and places Braxton Bragg in command. And that's a bad move. But Beauregard, because of his fame, because he's very popular with people, he's got to have a suitable command, and that suitable command is the defense of Charleston. The Federals really want to capture Charleston because they consider it a snake pit or the birthplace of secession, and so they that's an object they want to have. So building ironclads in Charleston become very, very important. Not just building them, but then also using them. And P.G.T. Beauregard, along with Robert E. Lee, were the really two major Confederate generals that are going to recognize the need to work hand in hand with the Navy. And, you know, Grant does it. The Union understand that mobility and how important it is. Not all Confederate officers or Army officers recognize the importance of the Navy. So Beauregard, now remember, Charleston is going to be heavily blockaded by the Federals. There's P.G.T. Beauregard. Here is, of course, Charleston Harbor. It's kind of like a cul-de-sac. Now, right here is going to be a bar that makes it difficult to come in and out of Charleston except at high tide. So basically, that's very important for the Confederates to recognize how to move their ironclads. Well, let me tell you about so this is all about the cotton for cannon trade that the Confederacy has to maintain. and ironclads become a very critical component. You can see how well Charleston is defended by forts, but really you have to harass ships if they try to break through the first line of fortifications. Battery Gregg, Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, and other batteries on Sullivan's Island. Consequently, we're going to recognize the Federals under the command, the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron, under the command of Samuel Francis DuPont, is making a very close blockade of Charleston. And so this is very difficult for the Confederates. Now, so meanwhile, they're building their ships, right? And so the first laid down is going to be this vessel, the Palmetto State. It's going to be 150 feet in length. Its beam is 34 feet. Its draft is 12 feet. Its armament is going to be 2 7-inch Brook rifles and 2 9-inch Dahlgrens. Now, there's one report that says they had 10 guns, but just looking at this original sketch, you don't have gun ports for 10 guns. So actually, it's 2 Brook rifles and 2 9-inch Dahlgrens. Now, they had a crew of 180, and she could make 6 knots, and her armor is 4 inches backed by 22 inches of oak and pine. Very similar in construction to the CSS Virginia, as we can see. So in April, another ironclad is going to be laid down. Now, the government of South Carolina pays for this. They pay $300,000 to have this ship and its sister ship, the Chicora, built at the same price. The Chicora is going to be built at James M. Eason's shipyard, basically it was a little bigger than the Palmetto State. Its length is going to be 172 feet 6 inches. Its beam 35 feet. Its draft 14 feet. Its armament, they had 2 9-inch Dahlgren shell guns and 4 32-pounder banded rifles. In other words, John Mercer Brook, the inventor of the Brook gun, also learned how to band older type of guns like a 32-pounder, which was a very standard type of weapon, shell gun for the U.S. Navy. But instead, he could heat the barrel and do a rifling machine, 7 twists and grooves, and then band it so that it made it more secure to fire. I have to tell you, both of these ships are going to be underpowered. Wow, there is the Chicora. We can see this a later image because you can see a part of Fort Sumter that is being crumbled down by the federal bombardment. Nevertheless, these ironclads are critical for maintaining the inner harbor. Now, I have to tell you that they were very underpowered. In fact, they were lucky when they made 5 knots. In fact, there's one story about the Chicora being anchored near Fort Sumter, and voila, it has to drop anchor to try and stem it against the incoming tide. And even that, the anchor dragged. They had full power on. So you can recognize these ships are really only useful in good weather, to tell you the truth. Now, the executive officer of the Palmetto State is going to be a man known as William Harwar Parker. And Parker was commander of the CSS Beaufort during the Battle of Roanoke Island, the Battle of Elizabeth City, and also he served on March 8th and 9th during the Battle of Hampton Roads. He will be reassigned to Charleston, and so he actually comments about the 2 ships. When these 2 ships had been in commission a short time, they were fine specimens of men of war and would have done credit for any navy. They were the cleanest ironclads that ever floated, and the men took great pride in keeping them so. I think Parker, of course, he's among several other very important Confederate naval officers that are going to serve at or in the Charleston Squadron, as we'll refer to it. The commander of Chicora is a man known as John Randolph Tucker. He actually was in the U.S. Navy since 1826. He was in command of the CSS Patrick Henry during the Battle of Hampton Roads. Another, I think, a very important person is going to be Duncan Ingram, who's going to become squadron commander of the Charleston Squadron. Now, Charleston Squadron is very fortunate because they perhaps have some of the best enlisted men, crew members, petty officers of any squadron in the Confederate Navy. And why is that? Well, number one, it's a very important port, and many merchant ships can't leave, so you have these excess sailors. Added to that, I think that they really benefit because the entire crew of the CSS Arkansas is going to be sent from, when the Arkansas is blown up near Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Those men all go to Charleston and become part of the Charleston Squadron. The Charleston Squadron actually has 3 African Americans in its ranks, so it's a major component for the Confederates, and so they have good officers, good crew members, a diverse crews, and so basically there we have these 2 ships, and Beauregard, who you can see him there. I have to tell you that's not a very accurate sketch, but still it's from the war. And basically Beauregard, even though he didn't like the ships, just thought they were, poorly constructed, under power, etc. But when you have a resource, you need to use it. And Beauregard he's got to keep Charleston Harbor open so that it can maintain that, as I refer to, cotton for cannon trade. So he also knew, now, there's not a lot of secrets in the North and South. I like to refer to the Monitor. They published the plans of the Monitor in February of 1862. Wow, Confederates get that. They go, oh my gosh, we know what they're building. When it leaves New York, it's announced in the New York Times. So the same type of information is being shared about the new class of ironclads, the Passaic class, which I talked about last week, with Montauk being one of them. Now, just think, we're now in January. These ships are going to be finished and commissioned in November of 1862. So this is a great picture of the Chicora. You can see it's not a big ship. You can see the breakwater right there. And so, in essence, Duncan Ingram does not want to risk his ships at sea. So these are harbor defense, not designed to go out to sea. Beauregard is going to really pressure him because he wants a strike before those ironclads come down south. And he's already received intelligence from Port Royal Sound that the Confederate, or the Union, has already had several monitors arrive in Port Royal Sound, including the Montauk and the Passaic. And so he fears that if he doesn't think these ships can stand up to a monitor, so he wants to break the blockade. There are all these legal rules about establishing a blockade. And if you are blockaded, if you break that blockade for 24 hours, then it is considered the blockade, especially by European powers like Great Britain and France. The blockade is broken, so the Federals, or the Union, would have to go through a process to reestablish the blockade. So Beauregard thinks, oh my gosh, if I can break the blockade, that means that the French and the British may just help deliver more supplies and be more supportive of the South than they were. So anyway, so Beauregard says, okay, you need to attack. Duncan Ingram goes, oh my gosh, he protested saying my ships can't do that. They can't go to sea. However, there was terrible storms in early January, same storms that sink the Monitor, and there are other storms. And it's not until late in January that Duncan Ingram considers it time to make an attack. So basically, on the evening of January 30th, 1863, Duncan Ingram will rush from the headquarters of General Beauregard onto the Palmetto State. He orders the ship's commander, Lieutenant Commander John Rutledge, to go out to sea. And so they will leave about 10. Now, the whole idea is to get over the bar at high tide. And that's really critical because this ship has a 14-foot draft. Believe it or not, that bar is pretty shallow, actually. So anyway, the Chicora follows in 15 minutes, and they're followed by 3 tugs, General Clinch, the Etuan, and the Chesterfield. And they have troops on board, but they don't cross the bar with these ironclads. Now, when they are able to cross the bar, and that's at 4:30 on the morning of January 31st, actually, the Palmetto State has 1 foot clearance over the bar. So, that can just tell you how important this is. So then, there's several Union blockading ships that are beyond the bar, guarding the 3 different types of channels that you can actually take to come into Charleston. They're guarding for blockade runners. In fact, the Mercedita, will be commanded by a man known as Henry Stellwagen, and they had just gone on a chase which proved to be a troop ship. And so they're exhausted. They come back to their station. Stellwagen tells his ex-officer, look, I'm tired. And he tells Lieutenant Commander Trevitt Abbott, just maintain watch, and I'm going to go to bed. And so with that, he goes down. 10 minutes later, all of a sudden, appearing off of the Mercedita is going to be what he thinks is a blockade runner, some unknown shape. They can see the smoke in the stack. The ship comes so close that they can't lower the guns. Abbott hits the battle rattle, and so they can't fire at it. They ring the alarm, and he hails this unknown vessel. And the shout back is, this is the Confederate steamer Palmetto State. And immediately thereafter, the Palmetto State rams the Union ship, creating a huge hole in it, number one. And at the same time, firing its 7-inch Brook gun right into the hull of the Mercedita. So basically, that shell is going to go through the engine room, goes through what they call a steam drum, the boiler, and then hit the condenser, and then goes out of the starboard side, blowing a 4-foot hole in the water line. Oh, this ship is in serious trouble. He felt the ship was sinking, and he believed he had no choice but to surrender his ship. And so basically, Abbott actually takes a small boat, like you see here, goes over to, that's Parker, who I talked about. There's Tucker, who I talked about. I keep forgetting to change my slides. There's Duncan Ingram. Actually, they called him an old woman because he was a hero of the War of 1812 as a midshipman. So, he's been in the Navy a long time. He's not as daring as some officers want him to be. Here is Henry Stellwagen, and you can see he is, a career Navy officer. You can see this is the ship itself, and we're not sure when this is going to be painted. So nevertheless, we're going to know that Stellwagen sends over Abbott. He says, look, Abbott tells Ingram, my ship is sinking. Ingram says, well, look, I can't take your men on board my ship because I don't have enough room. And so I don't have any ship's boats. And so you need to take care of yourselves. But I can't stop and board you. So I'm going to have you make a pledge. And actually, Ingram said that he regretted that he had no room to accommodate the Union crew. And he demanded Abbott give a parole of honor so that the officers and crew would not take up arms against the Confederate States during the war unless legally and regularly exchanged. Meanwhile, the Chicora is heading towards what is known as the Keystone State. And this is a side wheeler, whereas the Mercedita is screw powered. The Keystone State has 163 officers and crew. It has 4 12-pounders, 150-pounder rifle, 2 32-pounders, and 2 30-pounder rifles. So it has great armament. However, they hear a cannon fire, and the commander of the Keystone State is a man known as William E. Leroy. And Leroy, there he is. He's actually nicknamed Lord Chesterfield for his insistence on good breeding and gentleman bearing, and he was a great stickler for red tape and easily excited. In other words, he's a little pompous. Okay, so at 5 a.m., he hears the shot. That was when the Palmetto State is engaging the other ship, and he immediately had his crew beat to quarters. He believed that it was an announcement that a blockade runner had been sighted. Soon the Keystone State noticed that a steamer was approaching that looked very suspicious, according to Leroy, and the side wheeler opened fire. The Chicora returned fire. A shell rumbled through the Keystone State's berth deck, killing and wounding several men. It also started a fire. Leroy, that he believed he was being attacked by both of the Palmetto State and the Chicora. He later wrote, it was discovered that there was one on either quarter, and we made them out from their peculiar construction to be ironclads after the model of the Merrimac. So here's his ship on fire. What does he do? He picks up steam. Now this ship is rated at 9.5 knot speed. However, he's going to get it up by tying down the pressure valves and everything up to 13 knots, because what he wants to do is have the wind blow out the fire, right? And that actually happens. And so he turns around after 10 minutes, putting out this fire. And so he decides he's going to ram the Chicora. When the two ships reached about 500 yards apart, some say 200, another person said 400, another person said 500. I think as soon as the Chicora saw what was going on, it would have opened fire. So nevertheless, a shell from the Confederate Ironclad hit the Keystone State, which the shell went through the port side, passing through both steam drums. Steam hissed through the sad ship as the Chicora continued to shell the Federal sidewheeler. Leroy thought the Keystone State was doomed with no motive power. The ship was filling with water and several fires were burning. This is the Keystone State. There you have it. Nevertheless, that he already had 40 casualties, 20 killed, 20 wounded. When you have the steam escaping through the ship, it is horrible, especially for the people in the engine room. However, he ordered the flag to be lowered as an act of surrender. However, he's told by the chief engineer that, oh, wait a second, we still have steam and we still can work one of our paddlers. And so they raise back up the flag, which the Chicora complains about. And soon other blockaders run on the scene because they hear all this cannonading. And this is about 6 o'clock in the morning. And so basically the USS Memphis comes and tries to do some action. It gets hit by one shell from the Palmetto State. The Keystone State is towed to safety. Basically, the other ships that come by, like the USS Quaker State, will actually get a shell into its hull below the waterline. It turns around and retreats. It's a paddle wheeler. And so basically, the Chicora and the Palmetto State are out there, and the Federals have disappeared. As Duncan Ingram will say, that there was no sight of a Federal ship anywhere. He takes his 2 ironclads. They're out at sea. It's actually, it was a perfect day, as Duncan Ingram will later say. Their limited speed did not allow them to really chase the Federal ships. But from the very beginning, the Confederate artillery, especially those Brook guns, proved to be far more accurate and effective than those of the Federals. So no Southern ship was actually damaged. The flagstaff of the Palmetto State is knocked off by a Union shell, but they missed all the other times. So it was haphazard firing. It was actually a perfect day for the Confederate ships to go out. The sea was calm and everything. By 8:30, actually, Duncan Ingram will say, the sea was perfectly smooth, as much so as in the harbor. Everything was most favorable for us and gave us no opportunity to test the sea qualities of the boats. The engines worked well. We obtained greater speed than we had ever had before. Wow, that's pretty good. So basically, he will later write that we had but little opportunity of trying our vessels as the enemy would not close. So basically, the 2 ships that it does damage, they both surrender. However, they are towed away and they cancel their surrendering, which is a violation of the rules of war. The Federals don't care. The Confederates do care, but it's too bad for them. So basically, this victory, so wait a second. Duncan Ingram is going to recross the bar, but he has to wait for the tide, so he will anchor near Sullivan's Island under the protection of the Confederate batteries from 8:30 until a little after 4 at high tide, where he then recrosses the bar. And as those Confederate ships go past the forts, there are guns are fired in triumph, and the Confederates, they have won a great victory. They're cheered by soldiers as they near their dock. They're cheered by the citizens of Charleston, many of whom had tried to watch as best they can. See, from, let's say, White Point Garden to the bar is 11 miles. So this engagement was at dark, and yet at light you could see, if you had a telescope, or binoculars, you could have seen the Confederates in a victorious state. Oh my gosh. Now the victory was quickly announced by General Beauregard. He sends a telegram to the Confederate Secretary of State, Judah Benjamin, saying, we've broken the blockade. And so Beauregard, of course, announced the blockade is broken. Judah Benjamin contacts, the British envoys, said, look, we've broken the blockade. However, I have to tell you, the Union come back on station as soon as they realize the Confederate ironclads have gone back into Charleston Harbor. And so no one acknowledges that the blockade had been broken. Nevertheless, you have to realize that the Confederate warships, the ironclads, very rarely, this is the only time they go to sea on an offensive action. Going outside the bar means you're at sea, and no other Confederate ironclad. They thought that the Virginia could actually go up to New York, and of course Franklin Buchanan says, oh, look, we're top heavy. All Confederate ironclads were top heavy. All of them suffered from bad motive power. They couldn't be far from a workshop because of those weak engines. So this is about as far as they could go. Mallory had hoped that the Virginia could go to New York and bombard the city, and that would bring victory, but the Confederate ship would have never gotten there. So as we know, the Confederates, these are harbor defense vessels, but this is, very important for the morale of the Confederacy. The citizens seeing all these expenditures on the Navy, and now all of a sudden it pays dividends in the minds of the public. And so the Chicora and Palmetto State will continue to serve. They'll build another ironclad, the Charleston. They're building another one called the Columbia when Sherman captures Charleston from the rear. And so all the Confederate ironclads are going to be scuttled by their own crews. And so that does not diminish the great record of both of these ships on 31 January 1863. And that's my story of Ironclad Strike. And so if you have any questions or comments, this is one of my favorite paintings. This is by Conrad Wise Chapman, and this is, and you can see Castle Pinckney in the background, Charleston as it sits there. If you have further questions or anything like that, you can email me, and I think Julie Murphy, my handler, will handle your questions and purvey them to me.
Thank you, John. I am Julie Murphy, and I have the pleasure of trying to handle Mr. Korstein. It's quite a challenge, but a pleasure nonetheless here at the museum. We do have some questions and a great audience today. Thank you all for joining us. This is terrific. We'll start with one from Catherine, John. She asked, was the nearest port north of Norfolk federally controlled? I think I read that right.
Yes.
I hope.
Well, I guess the ports would be Baltimore is federally controlled, Washington's federally controlled, Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, those are all federally controlled and never at risk. If the Virginia could have gone anywhere, it would have had to stay in the bay. The trouble was their engines were so bad that they couldn't risk being that far from a workshop. So there was a way, however, they could have, even with the draft of 22 feet, the Virginia could have shelled Baltimore. They could have gone through the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal and attacked Wilmington and Philadelphia. But the trouble is, the ship is not seaworthy. And I don't know how many of you all been sailing on the bay, and sometimes it can get right rough. And so, and that was Buchanan's opinion, that it was like, you know, like a turtle, I guess he would call it. So anyway, so yes, the nearest federal port. Now for the Confederates, however, operating in Charleston and Savannah, they are within striking distance, especially from Savannah to Port Royal Sound.
Mhm.
And they do have a desire, especially in Savannah, where they will convert the blockade runner Fingal, which is a rather new ship. They'll convert it into the Confederate ironclad, the CSS Atlanta. And because she has a 16-foot draft, which is a little too much, but nevertheless, she has great engines, great guns, great armor, great everything. But that's another story. But they were planning to try and take that through the barrier islands and recapture Port Royal Sound.
Which you just had a lecture on that can be seen on our YouTube.
That is quite correct.
Yes, so if you missed that lecture, do tune in. Kevin is asking, since the Confederacy was not recognized as a country, what is the legality of raising a blockade?
Well, the legality is they are recognized as a belligerent nation, all right? And so the Confederacy doesn't formally recognize the Confederacy, but when the Nashville comes into Southampton, Great Britain, they lower their flags. They have passed already an act of neutrality, making regulations the British couldn't serve in the Confederacy or the Union, so forth. They can't directly provide cannon and so forth. They do anyway, but that was through private citizens. So there are all these rules that they granted to the Confederacy because they recognized that they were a belligerent, right? And they were a belligerent because Lincoln had declared the blockade, and so that made the Confederacy a belligerent nation.
Okay.
But they didn't formally recognize it as a nation. That's a slight difference, I would have to say.
Reggie asked, what's the origin of the name Shakura? It sounds like either a beer or a cigarette to me. What do you think?
It's not. It's a bird. It's a rail bird, Chicora.
It's a bird.
It's a bird.
Okay.
Seabird. Long legs, kind of neat little snout. I actually have a decoy of one. So yeah, what can I say? And Palmetto State, of course, that's the symbol of the Confederacy.
Right. Have the scuttled wrecks been discovered?
Yes, they have. They've actually been cleared away, like so many ships. I mean, part of the Georgia was cleared away for dredging, and then they said they were going to dredge again. They said, "Well, wait a second. Now we recognize the importance of this." I mean, the wreck of the Virginia, which is the Confederate ship I studied the most, by 1876. The whole hull is pulled out of the mud at Craney Island and taken into dry dock, where it will be scrapped. And that's where you get the canes and little nails from. And so Old Dominion Nail Works and Tredegar actually buy much of the leftover iron and then turn some of it into trinkets.
Lauren asked, I'm assuming there was a legal debate afterward regarding whether the blockade had been broken.
No, there was. I mean, that once Great Britain and France did not recognize the blockade was broken, that's about it. It would take them to say, yes, Charleston is a free and open port. But it took less than 24 hours for the Federals to get back on station, and which they did. Had the Chicora and Palmetto State stayed at sea for 24 hours or more, especially if they could be at Sullivan's Island, fairly protected. then they would have had the ability to maintain that open, or they would be able to maintain that, yes, we have broken the blockade.
Okay. Were Palmetto State and Chicura's ironcladding made by Tredegar
Yes,
in Richmond?
yes.
Okay.
It's not till later that they develop other, Slocum and Markham is going to be the next best roller of iron, as we might say. So Slocum Markham gives iron for the some of the ironclads in Atlanta, in Savannah, as well as Mobile Bay.
Welcome back, Michael. Michael's asking what pound shell or shot is fired by a banded 32-pound rifle?
Well, because it's rifled, it's going to have a conical Brook shell, they do not have any Brook bolts, which is elongated steel-tipped shell. But so it'd be a 32. It's about 100 and the shell would have been about 120 pounds for that once it's been converted. And that would have been the ones that were converted were the model 1857 32-pounder naval guns, and they are shell guns. Okay, the Mariners Museum has one of them, and it's so yes, it made them more effective. If you are anywhere near Yorktown, go over to Gloucester Point, and they have part of a burst Confederate gun there. And you can see how it was re-rifled. It's a 32-pounder that was re-rifled down in Gosport Navy Yard. People didn't really trust them very much, but nevertheless, it's the best the Confederates had. You had to have these rifled guns. Mallory was very insistent because they gave greater range, and a Brook gun, as proven at Drury's Bluff, and during the attack on Charleston in April, Brook guns could do some very heavy damage to a Union monitor.
I want to ask my question before I forget it. You said that the pair of ironclads that we're talking about today cost $300,000
each.
Each.
Yes.
What does that, is that then or now money?
Oh, that's then money.
So what would that be today money?
Whoa, I probably, I would say $30 million.
Wow.
I mean, I'm just trying to think about how inflation has changed everything. I mean, money used to be fairly stable, and yeah, it's, you have a lot of iron, you've got an engine, you got to pay the carpenters and everything. So they're ships of war, just like you would see today, much smaller. The biggest one was over 172 feet, 76 feet, 0.5 inches, so they were compact vessels. The Confederates learned, really, these are the Chicora and Palmetto State are considered the Richmond class, but they really differ, each of them, in their construction, as you can really see how one is much bigger than the other. Now that is supposed to be a torpedo that they had rigged on the bow, so that this is obviously, by looking at the flags, this is in 1863, because in January of 1863 they changed the national flag of the Confederacy to what they called the stainless banner. So the idea of the torpedo was, in case a monitor came along, you could put the torpedo beneath the monitor, because we know one of the biggest weaknesses, as we learned last week with my talk about the Montauk, they were the hulls were susceptible for torpedo damage. The Montauk, could have sunk by the torpedo damage it had. It did not, thanks to the quick action of John Worden and the pilot named Murphy. Kind of maybe he's your cousin, Julie. But yeah, so the Patapsco, there's several others that are sunk as a result of torpedoes.
Paul asked, what was life like for the sailors on these ironclads?
I would say miserable, especially in the summer months. Anyone serving on an ironclad in the summer months, you're really in trouble. I mean, I know most about the Monitor and just how they all complain. Now, they tried to fix the problem on Passaic class and later classes by making larger blowers, bringing the air down through the turret onto the berth deck, but it is never sufficient. In February of 1863, during the bombardment of Fort McAllister, they record the highest temperature in the engine room. You ready for this? 104 degrees, and that it averaged 103 degrees. So these ships with their engines on were hot no matter what time of year. They were damped, primarily because they had these slow leaks where, the casemate came onto the wooden hull. It's so often, like the Mobile Bay Squadron, they had a ship next to the Tennessee where the crew could stay because it was cooler. Just think, I got me an iron thing in the South in the summer, and the Confederates were smart enough to paint their ships a bluish gray, battleship gray. Some people would call it, but it's a little bluer than that. The Federals, though, sometimes they did that. Most of the time, those bad boys are black, right? We know they paint the Monitor gray in August 1862, and as one to try to get rid of all that terrible heat. And just think, if I got me an ironclad in the South in the summer, and gosh, it's humid, it's hot, it's terrible. So I think there's this journal of this one paymaster, I'm trying to remember his name, Stedman, and he put out, they published a book probably in the 1980s, and he had all these sketches that he did on board a Monitor, and I have read the book for I think 30 some years. So, but I can remember, complaining about the heat when Keeler does, so they're not good ships to live on.
Not a cruise ship.
No, I would not pay. You have to pay me to go on that.
One, yeah. Kevin asked, what is a good resource for information on Civil War naval guns?
Naval guns. There is a lot written about John Mercer Brook and his style of guns. There are some books, I can't recall the titles, but there's several books about Civil War artillery, which includes Parrott rifles and Brook guns, because they were used in shore defense and so forth. So there's a lot of information. I would say you could read my book on the CSS Virginia to understand both shell guns and Brook rifles. So there's a banding process. And I know in my CSS Virginia book, I explain that because this is the first Confederate ship to have these banded rifles. And so that had a huge impact. And Brook had invented an armor-piercing shot. However, that is still up in Richmond. And so, because they didn't expect the Monitor to be there as quickly as it got there. So nevertheless, and there's several biographies of John Mercer Brook. one written by his I think it's his grandson or great grandson, who was a professor at VMI, historian, and he had his father's papers. His father was a professor at VMI also after the war. So, you know, there's a tremendous 2-volume set. There's also a 1-volume that's a quicker read, but it goes into detail about how Brook designed what he did. So I know there's one book entitled Civil War Ordnance. In fact, I looked at it the other day because I had to look up something, but I can't remember. It's like published in the 60s. So I wish I could remember. Can't remember everything.
Remember a lot. Noel asked, how did the gun at Yorktown burst? What happened at that moment to make it burst?
What happens is you have this great release of gases. And so you have a cast iron gun, and then you band it with a wrought iron band. And the pressure of the gases will cause it to burst. It sometimes bursts, in this case, it burst right when it was fired. And so you can see part of the banding of the gun, and then you can see a chunk of it. And then you can look at actually the rifling. So it's right at Gloucester Point. They have a nice park there because the fortifications at Gloucester Point play a great role in the Second and Third Anglo-Dutch Naval Wars, believe it or not. I just thought I'd throw that out. The Revolutionary War, and of course, during the Civil War.
Noel comes back here asking, was it a particular battle or a training accident where it burst?
That's not documented. I would say, perchance, you know, the guns at Gloucester Point and Yorktown really are not fired in action that much, except on May 4th, when Captain Thomas Jefferson Page of Roswell, excuse me, he delays the Union moving up the York River to try and cut off the Confederates by landing near West Point. There's actually a place called Eltham's Landing they're trying to get to. But he maintains his battery, which were 9-inch Dahlgrens. So he continues to fire into the river. The York River at that point is only a half-mile wide. And so it's, so he does that from morning until around 1 o'clock, when he spikes his guns and goes north towards Richmond. So anyway, that's my story on that. So they just don't say when that happened, because it was found long after the war. It was found there at Gloucester Point. I'm sure they practiced their guns. Gloucester Point fired its guns in anger twice. Well, more than twice, but 2 major times are May 4th, 1862, and then again May 7th, 1861, with the Richmond howitzers.
Okay. David asked, how did these sailors stand the noise from the guns firing and the shells hitting the armor? Probably not very well.
How
did they? Yeah.
No, that was a joke. Actually, when you fired the gun, you were supposed to put your hand over one ear and open your mouth. And that's what you were supposed to do.
Oh.
Now, my dad served in several wars, and he was deaf because they didn't have little earplugs back then. So if you look at the records of both the crew of the Virginia and the Monitor, like I have, in both cases, they are, I would have to say, many of them say, look, I'm deaf, you know.
Right.
In fact, Isaac Scott was sheriff of Buffalo, New York, and he had his pension saying he was deaf. So I don't know how you can be a deaf sheriff, but, you know, I guess you can.
I guess you can. Greg's jumping to a different battle here. How large was the ram Albemarle in comparison to the Merrimack?
Well, the Merrimack was 262.9 feet in length. The Albemarle is about 100, I think it's 142 feet in length. So what the Confederates did, John Luke Porter, who was the chief naval constructor of the Confederacy, he actually started to build ironclads that were flat bottomed, and he tried to lessen the weight. So you had more elongated ends, and you had what is called a diamond shape casemate. So the Albemarle only had 2 guns on it. They were pivot guns that had 3 ports, they could fire out of, forward and starboard and port. So they were pivot mounted Brook rifles, and they did very good, actually. The Albemarle was a very successful ship.
Well, and you have a YouTube about that as well.
Do I now? I think I have a blog about it. What do you know?
So check that out. Michael wonders, were there other Union ships stationed at Charleston that came back to reimpose the blockade?
Oh, yes. The Quaker State is probably the best example. I would say, what else? They had, let me just see here. The Memphis came back on station. So, you had sufficient ships. I don't have a list of the entire row of blockaders, but I do know that they always maintain approximately 10 ships off of Charleston, because you do have 3 ways into the harbor. And so, and the Federals are going to learn how to put picket boats out so that they can be right at the channel entrance and try to stop. They do that especially at Fort Fisher.
Mm-hmm. Our last question here is from Dr. Littlefield. He gets our prize today for being our furthest away person. He is a researcher in Turkey. So we are thrilled to have you with us. And he wonders, do we know the exact location of James Eason's shipbuilding facility in Charleston? Has it been identified?
They built the Charleston Navy Yard after the war,
right,
and that consumed part of Eason's shipyard. So if you look at the boundaries of the Charleston Navy Yard, which operated until 40 years ago, 30 years ago when they closed it, that's where you'll find that shipyard.
And advance to your last slide, John, and I'll just tell folks about what's coming up next. Next Friday, we will have a Hampton Roads history lecture with John about the World War I port of embarkation in Newport News, huge facility and very involved in World War I. And then the following Friday, we'll have another Hampton Roads history about the gentleman pirate Steve Bonnet. That will be given by Jeremy Moss, who's written a book about Mr. Bonnet. And Mr. Bonnet dresses just as nattily as Mr. Corstein. So tune in for wardrobe tips about pirates from Jeremy Moss. And we do appreciate you all being with us today. Great crowd, great questions.
Hey, Julie.
Yes.
So we do have hand raised.
Oh, sorry.
Yep. So I just want to let's see here. Christopher, I'll go ahead and allow you to talk.
Thank you. I didn't see that.
That's okay.
Oh, he's on mute.
Yep. So Christopher, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, then you can ask your question.
I'm unmuted. Okay. Hi.
There you are.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.
All right. And actually, as far as I don't have a question specifically, but my research on ironclads, usually as far as the USS Galena and USS Ironside.
Mhm.
So those are, and you mentioned in the question answer, you did say that the Drury's Bluff had the Brook gun, and
Yes.
that's very interesting. And of course, the Monitor couldn't engage quite effectively with um, the bridge line, but the Galena was able to spring back and forth and ended up with several dozen holes.
Yeah, the Galena was holed 13 times, I believe, at Drury's Bluff. And actually, the Monitors hit 3 times, one by a Brook gun, because when you look at the turret, and I used to be director of the USS Monitor Center, so I got to do that lots. And so right near where the turret came into the brass ring, there is a shot that screws in about 3 inches deep. And so that's from a Brook bolt, just think of it, how it, would have been spinning, steel tipped. You can see the damage of the Galena in some photographs where you have sabots where shot went through. So yes, Drury's Bluff had the advantage of, number one, having the crew of the Virginia there, the Bedford artillery, the Southside heavy artillery. They trained on their guns, and they were using solid shot like a 42-pounder. Nevertheless, when the crew of the Virginia, they'll march to Suffolk, get on a train, go to Richmond, then they're sent down to Drury's Bluff just in time to build additional earthworks and mount some guns from the Yorktown or the Patrick Henry and the Jamestown. Does that answer your question?
That answers my question. Yeah, that battle just emphasized the ironclad inability to go beyond something that was.
Yeah, it was really the Monitor. I don't think I've done this lecture before, but Monitors were very flawed vessels. Let me just put it that way. Number one, it limited firepower. Number two, it couldn't elevate its guns very well, right? Especially when they had a 15-inch gun, they couldn't even stick the gun barrel out of the gun port. So when you look at pictures of it, it's like, oh my gosh, So I would say that the Monitors had problems. They weren't ocean-going vessels. They really didn't go that fast. They tried to have 2. They even had one, the Roanoke, with 3 turrets, which is crazy. The Union, I think I did that program. I think I do have a YouTube on the Roanoke. It's like they wanted to have 4 turrets, but they said the Roanoke is a sister ship of the Merrimack. So if the Confederates can turn the Merrimack into an ironclad, we can do the same with the Roanoke. Well, they didn't put enough support, in the hull to handle these huge turrets. Just think, a turret weighs 121 tons. Okay. Then you put the guns in, and so that's a lot of stress. So anyway, I think ironclads of the Civil War are pretty fascinating when you see how they try to marry ship design with propulsion systems, with a modern, at that time, modern firepower. Worden, in his report about the Passaic class ironclads, he does 3 major reports about them. And he says we need to arm these with rifled guns, so they can be more effective. And some people say, well, what if they burst? Because 100-pounder Parrots like to burst. Only one Brook gun was known to burst, and that was in Charleston. And it was kind of a funny story. So they're firing, they fired their gun, the gun burst. News goes up to Brook. Brook comes down to Charleston, interviews the crew members. What happened? Oh, we double shotted it because we really wanted to get them Yankees, Well, you can't do that with a rifled gun, But those yahoos didn't know that, I guess, or I don't know. They did double shot guns if it was a smooth bore often, I have to tell you, with solid shot.
Okay,
Anything else, Christopher?
I think that's it from him. So we've got just two more for quick questions here. So Daniel or Danielle, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself. I see that you had your hand raised. Last name Kafta.
Yeah, I don't see that hand raised thing, Tim. So I'm glad you are.
Yeah, she needs to unmute herself.
Yep.
Oh,
there we
she
go.
goes.
Well, yes, okay. I really didn't put my hand up, but actually I did have a comment. I was hoping you would do some programs on Fort Fisher.
I have done that. I've done 3 programs that you can find on YouTube. Now those are just half-hour programs, but because when we started doing all this virtual stuff, we didn't know how long we could go. And of course, today we have gone an hour and 10 minutes, so which is fine. So you can go to the website, which you can see, and you can see Mariners Museum blogs. So you can read the blog I wrote, or you could go to the YouTube at the Mariners Museum and you'll find the Fort Fisher programs. Actually, I talk about, one is all about the entire defensive system that Fort Fisher was part of, including Fort Caswell and so forth. And then I do one on the first attack on Wilmington, and then one on the second attack on Wilmington or Fort Fisher. And so, yeah, it's so you've got an hour and a half of stuff you could watch about Fort Fisher. So it's a fabulous history and a fabulous place. I've been there. Of course, only the land face batteries and Battery Buchanan still exist, but they are fantastic to go to. And you recognize that the Federals' capture of Fort Fisher led to the capture of Wilmington. That was the last outlet to the outer world for the Confederacy.
Mhm.
Other than Matamoros, Mexico, which they could then move stuff through Brownsville. But they didn't have a railroad that went from Brownsville to Richmond. I just have to tell you that. And so just getting guns to Galveston, they had to bring them to New Orleans, then to Shreveport, and then they had to take them by wagon, down to Galveston. So you just imagine.
That's a trip. Mhm.
Transportation issues were a big problem for the Confederacy, especially as time went on. Their railroads became worn out, and there was little maintenance because everybody wanted that iron, right? And so, but yeah, thank you for that, Danielle. And I hope you can go back and look at those. And if you have any questions about them, there's my email address, and you can just give me. That's not me pondering there, by the way. I just want to let you all know.
No, it's not.
That's Lieutenant Jeffers, who was in command of the Monitor at the Battle of Drury's Bluff, and actually wrote some very critical comments about monitors or the Monitor. Okay. Anything else you'd like to know, Danielle?
No, just a comment. I just always thought that the naval bombardment was just an amazing display of Union power.
Oh, yes, it was. And it was a very regular, see, the first time they went with Ben Butler and David Dixon Porter, who was then commander of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron, they just bombarded the fort, and it didn't really have an effective bombardment. They had the powder ship, the Louisiana, they blew up, didn't work. Butler says the earthworks weren't damaged, so he didn't want to attack. He reloaded his troops. He gets fired. They come back the second time. You can actually look in the official records, and well, anyway, you can look and see how they planned the bombardment, what angles. So they had covering fire from monitors and from frigates and sloops that really focused on certain parts of Fort Fisher, particularly the Pulpit Battery, the Mound Battery. I mean, they and the land face batteries. Of course, they had huge traverses. So yes, it was, I think, the most successful naval bombardment of the Civil War by terms of planning and execution, because the fort was really damaged, although not completely, because once again, you know, you've got a sand fort, so shells just go into them. So you got to cut your fuses so the shells burst over. And you also have to aim at the gun positions, destroying those guns. And you can see photographs of Fort Fisher after the battle, and you can see some of the damage to Confederate artillery that occurred during the second bombardment. Anything else?
For your comments. And John's next Civil War lecture is February 5th, Forts Henry and Donelson. So he'll be turning back to the Civil War in a couple of weeks, but we do hope you'll join us for the next 2 Fridays for our Hampton Roads history lectures, with John doing one next Friday. And I believe we've captured all our questions and comments, Tim, yes?
Yes, it appears so.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you, and thank you, John, for another great presentation, and we appreciate your sharing your knowledge with all of us.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, all. Thank you so much.
Huzzah.
Bye.